2024 to order. Please rise. The invocation is a moment of silence for first responders that lost their lives. Pledge. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We need the clerk to call the roll.
Vice Chairman Lohan.
Here.
Board Member Lombardo.
Here.
Board Member Cola Pietro.
Here.
Board Member Doogie.
Here.
Board Member Townsend.
Here.
Board Member Maturo, Chairman Maturo. And he is absent today.
Thank you. We need a motion for the approval of today's agenda.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Do we have any public comment on today's agenda? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move to item 6, the review of the following comprehensive plan amendments for consistency with the City of Bonita Springs Comprehensive Plan.
Good morning. For the record, Jacqueline Genson with Community Development. With us today, we have Dr. Margaret Banyan from Oregon State University joining us.
Can you pull your mic closer?
Zoom, sorry.
There we
this
go.
Better?
Yep.
Great. So we'll go ahead and do an introduction, but Dr. Banyan's been with the city conducting a lot of our city-initiated comprehensive plan amendments, specifically our evaluation and appraisal review. This is her second time assisting us with that process, and she'll go over that in detail with her presentation on what that is, because some of our board members were not here when we did the evaluation and appraisal review last year. What I wanted to do is just kind of complement the discussion we had last month on the role of the local planning agency as it involves this process. So last month, we explained how it's important for the local planning agency to review proposed land development regulations, because that is set forth in Florida statute. Well, also in Florida statute, the local planning agency's main role is to go ahead and provide input. You are the leading agency that provides the recommendation to City Council as it relates to the city's comprehensive plan. So here, the evaluation and appraisal review is an evaluation of the plan, and based on that review, there were recommendations of amendments that the city should go ahead and embark on. And we'll go ahead and explain those two different categories. So your role today is to review those amendments as the recommending body to the City Council for consideration to adopt those amendments as set forth in Florida statute. Are there any general questions? Okay, great. Without further ado, Dr. Banyan, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Did she hear you?
Dr. Banyan, can you hear us?
I think we're muted.
Dr. Banyan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I didn't hear the initial part of the presentation, but it sounds as if you got kind of a bit of a discussion about the role of the LPA in the reviewing of the comp plan. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thumbs up. I see Carly's nodding her head yes.
Correct.
Very good, thank you. So I have a short presentation this morning, and then what I hope to do is engage you in discussion and questions and get your recommendation regarding moving forward with the comprehensive plan. So I have a presentation to share. Let me get my share screen up. So the comprehensive plan update is based on the evaluation and appraisal review process. And what I want to talk a little bit about what that is relative to the state of Florida and to the city of Bonita Springs. So the state of Florida requires that all cities and counties in the state create this evaluation and appraisal review every 7 years. And the purpose of that document is to do two things. One is to reflect on changing conditions in the city. So as things change, the assumption of the state is that your comprehensive plan would also change. So changing conditions in the city, such as demographics, housing build out, where you're at with some of your environmental policies, etc. So that's one of the first purposes, and the state encourages, but does not require the city to do a full review of those changing conditions. There's certain elements that are required, and yet they do hope that cities will do a full review. The second piece of that evaluation and appraisal review is the state required portion. And that requires the city to look at any changes at the state level. So any state statute change in the last 7 years, and to evaluate whether the city's comprehensive plan is still consistent with those changes. And in that, the city will, if there are changes needed, so again, that's the last 7 years, if changes are needed, then the city sends what's called an EAR notification letter, or a notification letter to the state saying that changes are needed in the comprehensive plan to be consistent with state statute. So that evaluation and appraisal review was due last April 2023. And then the state allows the city 1 year to make any state required changes. So the portion we're at now, and I'll provide a little bit of a timeline, the portion we're at now is those, we call them EAR-based amendments, and those will be due April 1, 2024. So the timeline, and again, we can talk more if you have questions about that state required process. The timeline for this process, we started with the EAR research in around May of 2022. And we developed an EAR report that was a comprehensive report, 100+ pages, evaluating all of the state statutory changes, as well as each policy in the city's comprehensive plan. And the portion that we delivered that EAR report by the deadline, April 1, 2023. And then around May of 2023, we started thinking about the amendments that are required for the city's plan to be consistent, and some other optional amendments that I'll talk about momentarily. Where we're at now is in the transmittal hearings. Following the transmittal hearings of the LPA and City Council, the state will conduct a review. Talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then we'll have adoption hearings. Those adoption hearings could extend into August of 2024. So in terms of kind of the process timeline, just to give you another picture about what's next, we're at the LPA transmittal hearing now. We will have some additional public meetings on March 5th, Tuesday, March 5th at 5:30 p.m. And we'll also have some public drop-in sessions that same day from noon to 2, just for any members of the public who would like to ask specific questions. And then March 6th, we have some additional public drop-in sessions, and we have the City Council transmittal hearing March 6th. After that point, we'll send the package and the amendments up to the state. And there's sort of two components to this review, and the reason why you have two separate packets. So the state coordinated review is required for the state required amendments. So anything that is required by the state to be consistent with your comprehensive plan, it goes through a state coordinated review. And that process, we send notification out to interested agencies as well as the state. Agencies have 30 days to provide their comments to the state, and then the state has 60 days to provide their comments back to the city, after which the city can move into an adoption hearing. So that's the state coordinated review. Then we have a separate package that's called the optional amendments. And those are things that are not required by the state, but they're optional for the city as it conducted its review, found certain things that should be updated. That can move under what's called the expedited review process. That's a 30-day review with agencies and the state. And so we would receive comments back roughly within 30 days under that expedited process. Following that, the city council will have their adoption hearings. We've aimed to align both of these processes because it makes most sense once you're looking at the comprehensive plan to look at it in a more holistic standpoint. It also provides us the opportunity to work with the public and provide that kind of public education that may be needed for both of these kinds of amendments. So I want to talk a little bit more about what we found in the evaluation and appraisal review, so you have a better understanding about what you're looking at. In the EAR findings, we, as I said, went policy by policy in the city's comprehensive plan. And we developed 3 sets of recommendations. So for each policy, we had 3 options. One was no comment, and that was pretty straightforward, that it appeared that policy was finely constructed in a way that was going to meet the needs of the city. Majority of the comprehensive plan policies fell into that bucket. Then the second bucket that we looked at was those that would be required by the state. So anything, again, that needed to be changed to be consistent with state statute. As you see in the packet, that's a relatively short list, and yet we'll talk a little bit about that. Needed quite a bit of thinking. But for this packet, those amendments are relatively short. And then the final bucket that we developed in the EAR was what we call the optional amendments. And those were any goals, objectives, or policies that might be insufficient to meet the city's goals. That's a broadly construed statement to say that it might be insufficient to meet the city's goals. And purposefully so, because these are optional, and at the time of the EAR, we wanted to provide the city with as much flexibility as possible with how they want to move forward. Again, it's not required and optional, but yet at the same time, the city should have some flexibility as to what it wants to move forward with. Out of those EAR findings, we developed an amendment scope. And in that amendment scope, we had the state required amendments. We knew we would have to do those in any case. And then we had that second bucket, which was optional. And those were limited amendments to the goals, objectives, and policies. So when we worked with council, because the comprehensive plan is long and it's involves quite a few elements, as you know. We wanted to really focus on those things that were pretty important to do. And so we framed this as a kind of a limited scope. And I'll talk about sort of that scope in a second, but what I want to go through first here is just an understanding about the state required amendments and what we found. So, as I said earlier, the state required amendments that you have in front of you are fairly limited. And one of the things, though, that required a lot of thinking was some changes in state statute. And so the changes in state statute that really did require some thinking were around two statutory additions that they had made. One was around solar facilities, and the other one was around floating solar facilities. We, early on, got a lot of questions about what's floating solar. So floating solar is what you see in these pictures. It's, for the most part, a solar facility that floats on top of water. So the solar requirement from the state, and I've provided that language in your packet, it requires that the city allow for solar use as a listed use in agricultural areas. As we dug into this analysis, what we found is that the city is an urbanized area, has no agricultural future land use categories, while there are agriculture allowed in your land use categories. It is not by nature an agricultural future land use category. So in terms of statutory requirements, that was not something that the city was required to do. The second piece of the analysis was also fairly in-depth, and you see a lot of discussion about that in your packet. And so in that, looking at floating solar, what the state required is that the city look at appropriate future land use categories for floating solar. It used the same definition as a solar facility, then added, of course, that floating solar floated on top of ponds or lime rock mines or retention ponds. So the challenge, of course, is to define what's appropriate. And that's something that did require a lot of analysis for the city. So where we started was to look at, where are the water bodies in the city that are large enough to accommodate solar, floating solar. And there were relatively few areas that we were talking about in the city. Floating solar requires, the installation that you're looking at, requires about 2 acres to be viable, and 2 acres of water for the facility. But as you can see in that Duke Energy article there, the water body is much larger than that. So this actually is in a 1,200 acre pond. And this is in the city of Bartow. So it's roughly 1,800 floating solar modules on 2 acres, but the pond is 1,200 acres. So it's a much larger body of water. So when you look at the city, there are relatively few areas where that would be possible. And then what we started to look into was some of the environmental considerations that may be present for floating solar. And the conclusion, I know you can read and probably have read in the packet some of the analysis, but the conclusion is there's still some growing research about the environmental aspects of floating solar. There are some benefits, it appears, and some of those benefits may be just that water will cool the facilities. Duke Energy is finding that possibly it's not interfering too much with wildlife. But again, you see that's a 2-acre and a 1,200-acre facility, 1,200-acre pond. But there are some other research articles that all point to the fact that more research is needed. There can be some concerns about leaching of heavy metals into groundwater. There can be some concerns about blocking sunlight, oil compaction, erosion, and disturbances on the water resources. Again, not having a full picture yet from the research because floating solar is relatively new. It does require some additional analysis. So as we looked at those conditions, we moved into kind of understanding a little bit more about character and compatibility with your future land use areas. And one of the things that we thought deserved some consideration is that many of the bodies of water west of I-75, even if they were large enough, are more or less surrounded by residential uses. Noting that floating solar does require battery storage and backup, and it requires some additional infrastructure, not just panels. Sarasota and the city included that residential areas were not necessarily, but most compatible with floating solar. Then the second thing we looked at is the water quality areas, and many of the facilities, or many of the ponds east of I-75, which is where you have most of your larger bodies of water, are close to or within the wellhead protection areas. So we provided that map of the wellhead protection areas in your packet, so you could kind of look at where those are relative to the larger bodies of water. And if it were allowed, floating solar were allowed, the city might want to develop some site-specific kind of mitigation measures. And that's what the research is also saying, is that from a water quality standpoint, it could be mitigated through water treatment. And so, especially within the wellhead protection areas, that should be something to consider. And then the final step was we went through each of the future land use categories where these larger bodies of water are. The conservation fringe, the DRGR area, and resource protection were the future land use categories. And in each of those, I can answer questions about the packet as well later, but in each of those, there were limitations in terms of intensity of use, some of the other requirements around plan developments, as well as thinking about the water quality. So the recommendation that we provided is that while there may be some benefits to floating solar, there's no future land use category that is inherently appropriate to include floating solar as a listed use or use by right. More appropriately, it would be appropriate to handle each request for floating solar, if they do come along, to be handled through the land development code or through a plan development or special exception process, which is not something that we would normally address in this comprehensive planning effort. So that took quite a bit of thinking, and that's the majority of your packet regarding the state required amendments. Some of the other state required amendments you'll see are name changes for consistency with statute, so they're relatively straightforward. And if I have a few more moments, I want to talk about the optional amendments, and so we can have a discussion about those. I violated my words, or my PowerPoint presentation skills on this slide. There's a lot of detail here. However, I think we can sort of summarize the optional amendments in 3 ways. So again, the optional amendments have a limited scope. Instead of taking a deep dive, the limited scope was to really update the comprehensive plan from a general overall perspective and address 3 things. One was more or less cleaning up some errors or outdated information, and that's what you see in that first bucket. There's a fair number of places where there's inconsistencies within the plan. So these do not rise to the level of state mandated changes. However, the city, for example, in the public school facilities, the city no longer has to require financial feasibility. So those were counted as inconsistencies. And I described that in your optional amendment package. And then there's another set of goals, objectives, and policies that are no longer consistent with the city's practice. And those took a little bit more thinking. For example, some of your housing policies, the agencies that are noted in those policies, they no longer exist. So the question for the city really was, how do we want to handle some of the affordable housing trust fund funds? And partnerships became one of the more relevant ways to do that. So you'll see in that bucket where I say no longer consistent with city's practice, that could be things where we just updated the policy, and it also could be areas where we removed the policy because that was not an action the city was continuing to take. Then the third category was goals, objectives, and policies that the city had completed. Because the comprehensive plan was written at the beginning of the city, when the city first formed, there were certain actions that were noted in the comprehensive plan. Those have been completed, and so some of those, most of those policies were updated or removed. And then the last bucket around sort of more or less of a cleanup approach was to look at outdated information. So a fair number of references to other agencies, a fair number of document titles. As things change, the county has changed the names of some of its documents. Those changes in who implements a certain strategy or policy, those were updated. And then there were a handful of typos that we addressed. Then the second area of optional update was higher priority goals, objectives, policies that were a little more urgent and that needed to be addressed. So some of those were around looking at adding Logan Boulevard as a constrained road. We can talk a little bit more about the logic in doing that, as well as updating your wellfield map, your long-range transportation map that's still pending, and your transit map. Those did not take a deep dive, but we were able to update those things relatively with relative expediency, because this was updated information. And then the last piece is around public participation element. You'll see in your packet that we're recommending a full rewrite of that element. And the reason for that is because that public participation element still refers to the initial formation of the city. In addition to that, the state does not require the full year anymore. That was the process prior to 2011. What they do require is the notification letter. Nowhere in the existing public participation element is the notification letter reference. So there's requirements around that that should be updated. And as we looked at that element, it was very confusing. So the full rewrite kind of helped clarify the requirements for public participation. And then the last piece around that element was some updates for the city in terms of its current practice. So the reason why I mention that in specific is because in your packet, you also have a public participation element, what we call a crosswalk. And that was taking the existing public participation element and demonstrating where those requirements were addressed in the new draft. That was an attempt for some transparency. So I apologize in your packet if that was a little confusing about why you were looking at three versions of the public participation element. The crosswalk, the old strike through, and then the new proposed plan. The last thing I'll mention, well, not quite last, but close to last, substantively, is that you also have a handout in front of you. After your packet was prepared and delivered, Florida Department of Transportation got back to us with their policy update, so that appears in your double-sided handout or two-page handout. You also have we have made some slight revisions to the floodplains map, and these were just formatting changes, but for the sake of transparency and update, that's in that packet. And then there's some minor revisions that were not caught when I prepared that amendment packet, and that appears under the second page called Additional Changes. Policy 11.1.5, there was a typo that we corrected, and that's just a very small grammatical error. And then policy 13.1.5 did not make it into your amendment packet, and that is an example of the document change, the name of the document changed. And so having updated document names is very important in a comprehensive plan, so that anyone looking at the comprehensive plan, know what document you're referencing. So some work was done to make sure that we have the proper documents there. And then the final thing is that we are not offering in your amendment packet, package, we had a policy in the coastal and conservation element listed, policy 11.2.8. We're not offering that for amendment. That was an error. The package, there's some updates from Florida Department of Transportation for the long-range transportation plan that should be reflected on that map. I just want to share with you now what we're doing next in terms of public input. One of the requirements that's been very important to the city is to have a good amount of public input. So we had lots of public input during the evaluation appraisal review process, including a pretty widely shared and lots of participation in a community survey. We also had public meetings, several public meetings for the year to help form some of the priorities for the city. And then in this process of amendments, what we've done is we had drop-in sessions on December 6th. We had a public meeting, first public meeting, February 1. We'll have the next public meeting, March 5th, Tuesday. And then also some drop-in sessions, March 5th, and then additional drop-in sessions before the council transmittal hearing on the 6th. And again, the drop-in sessions will be helpful, I think, if there's folks that want to comment on specific policy language now that the draft is available. there may be people that want to have input there. And then just in your packet, I want to note some things for the future that are not, we're not recommending that you address today. The recreation and open space element required a bit more deep dive and deliberation than this process was scoped for. So as the recreation and open space element, we're recommending that be looked at holistically. It's a short element, but at the same time, there's many things that have changed in the city, and so making sure that element is properly constructed and reflects the updated planning documents is pretty important. And then you'll also see a water supply plan update. So initially, we had envisioned fixing some inconsistencies in the comp plan, but that's going to really require the water supply plan to be updated. So we left those alone for now, knowing that plan will be updated, I believe, in the next 2 years. And then there's other areas that might need more in-depth analysis. Those were not part of this scope, and those we're hearing from I've heard from the public and need to look at some other areas of the comp plan, and those just require more deliberation. So we did not provide those updates as part of this process, trying to keep it relatively streamlined. So now I think what we're looking for from you is any questions that you have, discussion, and then when you provide your recommendations, you would be providing your recommendations to council regarding transmittal of both the state required amendments and the optional amendments. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you a little bit better. Happy to share again if there's additional things that you want to look at.
Thank you. All right, who has questions? Go ahead.
Regarding the floating solar, I know that it's recommended by the state for us to allow it, and it gives us some parameters, et cetera. And I noticed there were some examples of what a couple of other communities throughout the states, what produced 1 megawatt of power. And I looked that up, and that for solar, by the way, 1 megawatt of coal as opposed to solar is a huge difference. Coal will supply about 500 to 900 homes of a year of power. Solar, 165. So I'm wondering, I mean, there was nothing in here about cost analysis or anything like that, but it appears to me that needs to be done to supply a year's worth of power for 165 homes. The cost of purchasing the units, installation, maintenance, battery power that has to be on site. I know we're not doing this for cost or to save monies, which I think we probably should look at. It's more for the green agenda, if you will. So those are my comments on the floating solar.
Is it okay if I address some of that as well? Is that, yes, I've seen several different recommendations or estimates as to what 1 megawatt, because that was my question as well. What's 1 megawatt of power? What does that mean? And so the estimates are around 100 to 165, like you say, and that really depends on how much sunlight you have. It depends on the battery, backup systems as well. And so, because when the sun's not shining, you're still using electricity, and so how large is the battery backup? The other thing I'll say is think the recommendations are, it may be needed, and yet at the same time, as a listed use by right in those future land use categories, it's questionable as to whether all of those future land use categories should by right have floating solar. And I think there's willingness on the part of the city to look at those if those facilities do come in as special exception. And then the last thing I'll just say is it does appear that a two acre floating solar is about what's financially feasible. That's from Duke Energy's thinking, as well as the city of Sarasota's analysis, who are allowing it in one future land use category.
Thank you.
Just to add on to that, I was glad to see that we actually spent a lot of effort looking at the other environmental impacts of those solar things, as opposed to trying to save one aspect of the environment, giving up the others. So the headwaters, the recharging areas, the algae blooms or whatever else that may occur due to the blocking of sunlight. I'm glad that was all taken into account before we just jumped on a bandwagon of embracing floating solar. Thank you for that.
No, just I concur with the effort of looking at the other environmental factors, because gaining one and giving up something in the others is an important issue.
Don?
No, I'm good with it.
The one question I have is under the DRGR, it says that special exceptions can be made for floating solar in the DRGR. I'd like that explained to me, because my understanding from when the DRGR was put in place until now, there have been several things that were added that were allowed in the DRGR. I'm not even sure. I think the station was actually part of that at one point. I'm confused about how easy it is to get a special exception. If you have an area that you're not going to build, fine. But if you say you have an area that you're not going to build, but all of a sudden it's okay to put floating solar, it's okay to do something else, I just don't know how easy or difficult the process that is to get special exceptions, and what's the criteria to meet the special exception rule in the DRGR? Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that Jackie and Michael and John can probably address that a little bit more specifically. One of the things that we looked at in the DRGR category that I provided as part of your packet is that currently it allows for public uses, nonprofit, recreational, essential services needed for health, safety, and general welfare of the community, lift stations, utility lines, equipment, and I don't know how to say that word, folks. Maybe Carly can help me. Appurtenances necessary for such systems to furnish adequate levels of service. And then if you look in the land development code, there's some reference to solar facilities, but I don't know, Jackie, Mike, or John, is that something that you can address a little bit more about the special exception process?
Of course. For the record, Jacqueline Jensen. So the thought process is, with the state mandate, handling things the way we have previously done this. So if you recall, we may not recall, but if you're familiar with the area, off of Cutting Horse Lane, there is an FPL substation, and that's in the DRGR. That had to go ahead and obtain special exception approvals for that facility to be built. And how that was analyzed by county staff at the time on behalf of the city, which that public hearing petition was analyzed to meet the Land Development Code regulations for special exceptions, and part of the analysis is consistency with the comprehensive plan. So with that facility being in the DRGR, the analysis was that the use was an allowable use because it was an essential service facility, So it was providing power facilities for the public health, safety, welfare to maintain levels of service for power generation. The special exception process not only looks at use and consistency for comprehensive plans, but the special exception process also looks at compatibility, whether the use is appropriate based on that location. And for staff, based on the current mandate in front of us, we felt that the process that we have now is still appropriate, because to go ahead and create a blanket policy to be applied anywhere is not appropriate, because every piece of property is different. Its characteristics are different. Its placement is different. What's surrounding it is different. So we felt that if a facility still wanted to be built by a private petitioner, they have every right to petition the local government for that use. We would provide them due process, and we would evaluate that application on its merits based on what they're proposing, site location, mass scale, impacts to the environment, impacts to the neighborhood. So to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis is more appropriate.
Regardless of whether it was priorly approved for that use, or is that part of it?
I'm just saying, in general, if a new application were to come in, whether if it was for a solar power facility, on water, on land, special exception process is a great tool to use, because it allows us to evaluate that specific request on that specific piece of property and the characteristics that surround it.
Would affordable housing be an issue for exceptional use on the DRGR at any point? Would that be, I'm kind of curious to see the one home per 10 acres. There's been pushback on both sides of the fence on that. I'm just, from past experience, just as a citizen, it seems like changes have been made over the last several years, and some things happened and some things didn't, and they infringed in certain places. And you can correct me where I'm wrong here, but I know affordable housing is one of the big things on everybody's agenda, and I'm just curious if portions of that, if it was done correctly, environmentally, would that be something that would be an acceptable special exception for affordable housing?
So at this time, our charge is to go ahead and implement the recommendations from the evaluation appraisal review, so the state required changes, which were for the solar and correcting agency names that have changed, and then we have our optional amendments. And the section of housing did not address any other needs to look at affordable housing. That's definitely something we can communicate to the council, that there's an interest to address affordable housing. But currently at this time, the existing policies for affordable housing are in effect. So, and what that is in each future land use classification, there's a standard density range, and then there's opportunities to request additional density through a bonus density provision. And whether that provision is done by providing the housing on site or paying into a fund, those are the current options that are available. Other incentives are with the downtown code amendments that we processed about 4 years ago. We created an incentive in downtown to go and create more affordable units by creating what we call equivalent residential units. So there's essentially a ratio for the size of dwelling units in our downtown, because the infrastructure and the facilities are in place, and it's a great opportunity for infill housing. So those are some other tools in our basket for affordable housing and workforce housing.
So basically, the future of the DRGR is not changing in any way, shape, or form without some type of special exception, and the special exception rule is kind of
I think what Dr.
wide
Manning
open.
was alluding to with the special exception process in the DRGR is, if for solar power, whether it be again on land or on water, there are existing policy and framework in place that would allow a petitioner to request that use. So we're not talking about affordable housing, it's just for the point of solar and the state mandate to address solar in our long-range plan. What options are available and how are we addressing that? And we feel it's most appropriate not to incorporate it into the long-range plan as a use by right, but to rather evaluate it on a case-by-case basis through our land development code processes.
Thank you.
I do have a question for the affordable housing. What is bonus density mean?
So bonus density means, so again, in each category, we have a standard range. So for example, one of our categories says, for general commercial, you can have up to 10 dwelling units per acre. However, if you provide affordable housing, you can request up to 5 additional units per acre. So it's just, and it's one dwelling unit. So one family could occupy one dwelling unit, whether it's in a two-family attached product or a townhouse, a multifamily product. You can have an additional density assigned on a per acre basis.
So that would mean more structures per.
It could be more structure, it could be mass and scale, it just depends on the composition of the unit and the types of units that they're asking for.
Okay, thank you.
I know we're getting off on a tangent here, but does the state require the deed restrictions, or is that something locally for low and moderate income housing? How is that monitored over the long
Yeah, so
while?
currently, under our land development code, for bonus density, you can either pay into a fund through our cash contribution process. In that instance, there's no deed restrictions. For the option to provide it on site, there are regulations in our land development code that go into a monitoring process. So annually, they actually have to submit reports to the city for us to review to make sure they are providing that housing to meet that specific income range.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I just have a comment on the DRGR, and we're going to go back a lot of years. But the DRGR was a blanket that was thrown over a vast area with no consideration whatsoever. And it became the battle cry. You know, everything was, oh, the DRGR is this. And over the years, it's been chipped away at till there's not much left. They pushed people out of their homes for this thing and then did nothing with the property. So when the DRGR comes up, it just kind of makes my skin crawl a little bit. It's just a personal thing. I thought it was wrong to start with, to place so much value on it when there wasn't a lot of consideration when it was originally done. It was just dropped.
Which is why there's a lot of questions about it, because history will show that, like Don said, they just picked an area arbitrarily, and you can't build on this sheet of paper, okay? Oh, wait a minute, you can build over here in this corner of this sheet of paper, you can build over here on this corner, and I guess I guess all of us probably feel the same way that have been here any length of time, is it appears that you can do development safely and still leave all the land that you need for everything else, instead of it being piecemeal like it has been. But, you know, and again, I know affordable housing, which I'm not sure what the definition of affordable housing in Bonita Springs is, but affordable housing obviously is a major, major problem for every business in this town. I mean, nobody can, I mean, even here in the fire department, you know, we pay decent benefits and salaries. And it used to be years back in like 08, 09, we get 400 applications for every job. Okay, today we're lucky if we can end up with about 7 that are qualified, that can afford to live here and make what they make to start. And a lot of them don't. If they work here, some of them will drive from Miami, some of them will drive from somewhere else because it's 24 on, 48 hours off. My point is, it's a major, I don't have to tell anybody here, it's a major problem that, you know, we don't have a place for these people to live, and we've developed a society that doesn't want those people around, but when they need something done, well, why aren't you here? That's all I got to say about that.
One of the things that I would just add to this discussion is that this is a growing problem throughout the country, I'm sure you're aware of, and some of the affordable housing strategies are involve a comprehensive plan, but also involve land development regulations, and it also involves a set of policies and structures that may be outside the city's control, as in terms of partnerships, et cetera. So one of the things that I think could be possible, I think, as Jacqueline had said, is to pass some of your interest about affordable housing on to the city council. There may be opportunities for a deeper dive into that topic in general. And as we did with downtown, so the city started to really look at downtown and develop the downtown form-based code, and along with that came some comprehensive plan changes. So sort of an integrated approach is most helpful when it comes to problems like affordable housing that are not just plan problems and they're not just code problems. And so that may be something that the LPA wishes to pass on. It would not be part of your recommendations, formal transmittal recommendations, but it might be something that you would like to pass on as well in council, or some additional study or thinking around that topic.
Agreed. Thank you.
Just one other note with the affordable housing, I think part of the bigger problem is the developers, because they want to make the most money that they can. So what incentives can the city give to developers to do affordable housing, being careful with the density issue of putting too much on a small piece of property?
So we will go ahead and summarize your comments on the current amendments and also some of the concerns you raised today at the transmittal hearing. And if there's any other official motion you would like to make so we can communicate to council on your concerns, we'll be happy to do so.
Are there any members that are here today? Any of the people in the audience have any questions that would like to come up and ask any questions?
Thank you, Chairman. The DRGR was demanded by the state of Florida. It wasn't a local decision to start with.
Will you state your name, please?
Oh, Rick Steinmeier, Mayor of Bonita Springs. The state decided that Lee County had too much property platted for the development. This was, I don't know, 30 years ago. So they get in a helicopter to go over. So this area here. Oh, well, one house to 10 acres. Well, we don't have to pay you for taking your land because you didn't take all of it. So this whole DRGR thing is stunk from the beginning. They really put it to the people because people had 5-acre plots, 1 acre. It was platted. They keep changing the government gets a bad reputation for changing things all the time. Well, currently, the city has said no to many offers to develop in the DRGR. And I think we need to be consistent with saying this is density reduction, groundwater resource. Well, along that line, I see that the Babcock Ranch has 800 acres of solar or something that they use for electricity for their development. Well, would solar really affect, in the DRGR, would it really affect the amount of water that got to the ground? That's the question I would think about. Because I don't think we could always take 10 acres and build a nice little farmette or whatever you want to call it. That's still available to the people. By right, they can do that. So I just throwing around the idea of the solar. I'm not too, I've seen so many houses, they put the solar on the roof and then a hurricane comes by and the solar's gone and now the roof is all tore up. So that's not too valuable to me. My understanding is that DRGR, you're allowed to have agriculture. So maybe if we raise the solar up high enough, they could agriculture underneath it, grow something, do something with it. But another aspect of this whole society of ours is we can't discriminate against race, religion, color, creed, everything else, but we can separate poor from rich, haves and have-not. We can put these, we got to do that as a people. We just got to classify people. By some way, we have to find a way to put them in someplace. And this affordable housing, you don't have to live in Bonita Springs, I'm sorry. You know, there's other places in this world that you can live. You know, like, you go to Mexico, there must be extra room down there. They're all coming across the border. They're coming in. We don't have to you don't have to live in Bonita Springs. And if you have to live, if you can't get people to work for you, you're going to have to pay them more. That's all it is. How did all these other 99% of the people that live in Bonita Springs ever afford to live here? How come maybe the 1% or 5%, whatever it is, how come they can't afford to live here? Maybe they shouldn't live here. So let's not segregate the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-not. And we'll think about what we can, if that solar might work. I don't know about putting it in the lake with the winds and everything, how it might work. But there's room for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Would anybody else like to speak? Okay, seeing none. We'll move on.
So just so I understand, does this board now have to make some formal recommendations? Okay. And it would perhaps be the best thing to separate the required amendments and then to consider each one of the optional?
So we would be looking for two motions. One is to, if you agree to transmit the state required amendments, or transmit with changes if you have specific changes you'd like. Or the second motion being transmit the optional amendments, or transmit the optional amendments with changes, including hopefully the changes that we provided on the handout that you received. Does that answer the question in terms of the process?
Do you have a good understanding of that, Vice Chair? So
now, I'm looking at, we've got these in subsections, okay? Do we need a motion for each subsection or one?
yes, so I would start with a motion to recommend transmittal of the state-required amendments as the first.
Okay, so.
And then a vote on that.
All right, well, that's how it's listed on here. So we need a motion for the 2023 evaluation and appraisal review, state-required amendments.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
We need a motion for the 2023 evaluation and appraisal review, optional amendments.
I'll make the motion again.
Do you suggest that they go
Second.
through each separately? Or
No.
what do you suggest?
Because it will all be on one ordinance, so.
Well, that's right, that was the question I asked, and I was under the impression that we had to do them separately.
So the state mandated would be one ordinance, and
Okay.
then the optional is going to be another separate ordinance, because they run on two different timelines with the state for
So
review.
we do need that motion and a vote on it.
Yes, sir, for the optional.
So we have a motion, and we have a second. Do we have any further discussion? All in
What
favor?
is that motion? Just so I understand, what is the motion?
The motion is the 2023 evaluation and appraisal review optional amendment.
To recommend,
To approve it.
to recommend transmittal
Right.
to the city
Yes.
council? Okay.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Everybody's, okay.
Any opposed? Just-
No. I think that concludes this, right?
we
This
have to
agenda
approve
item,
the
correct.
minutes of the last meeting?
You're right, no, but I mean, at this section, we're good on this, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. We have item 7, update on agenda items, LDC Chapter 4 amendments from the LPA meeting held on January 18, 2024.
Okay. Good morning again. For the record, Jacqueline Genson. So the LDC amendments that were before you last month were for a change to create an administrative variance process for the downtown, also fence code changes, and then employee housing changes to the land development code, so creating those new standards. They did go before the city council for first reading. They were forwarded on to second reading. The second reading was yesterday. The council had some questions on the fence code, but primarily on employee housing. They wanted to see a couple of changes, and we intend to bring those back to the city council for second reading on March 6th.
Okay. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay, thank you. Now we need a motion for the approval of the minutes from the LPA meeting held on January 18, 2024.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And we got to pick a date for the next meeting. Do you have a recommendation?
Correct. So I know there was some discussion on the dates in general. So typically what we like to do is have the LPA meeting the Thursday after the second city council meeting, which is the third Wednesday of the month. We obviously only hold those meetings when there are agenda items to bring to your attention for direction. At this time, we don't have anything scheduled for March, so I don't believe we will have a meeting for you. But just to let you know, primarily, we do try to schedule those LPA meetings it's typically the third Thursday of the month. It just depends how the days fall. But it's usually always the Thursday after the second city council meeting.
So we're going to leave that open so that if you don't want to schedule a meeting for March, definitely?
Right now, we don't have any agenda items, so at this time, there's no meeting for March.
Do you want one for April? Do you want to set a date for April, or don't you know that yet?
We can keep you informed. We will work with Jackie and her team and keep you updated.
I guess from a board perspective, you know, if people are making plans, we probably should know that, all right, well, let's just say that the third Thursday of the month, to try to just put that on your calendar as an option so that, you know, there's enough of us here to do the job.
Okay.
Fair?
Thank you, sir.
Question. What constitutes an issue that gets brought before the LPA? Suppose the LPA has its own issue. Does that, like, in other words, I heard some discussions about the DRGR zone, and there was, like, what happens to that? Suppose there's something that we wanted to discuss and have it brought forward. How does that work?
Well, and I could send it to each of you. So there's the governing ordinance. So you have a mission. So there's really only certain things that the LPA can consider and vote on. It's your guiding ordinance. So I'll provide that. And I'll also turn it over to Jackie as to if she has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, typically there is a council liaison that you can also communicate your concerns with.
So it has to start at the top and come back down again. It can't start here and go back up.
Well, let me go ahead and work with the clerk on that ordinance with the charge. Depending on the topic, subject matter, it probably does relate to the comprehensive plan where you can have some discussion on that. But let's coordinate with the clerk's office and the city attorney's office, and we'll let you know.
Thank you.
We have a meeting on the 5th, we have a meeting on the 6th. We have a public meeting with Margaret on the 5th. We have a city council meeting at 5:30 on the 6th. It's also going to be here in person, I think, on the 6th. Is that right?
That is correct.
Whether we put you folks in the ballot, I don't know. But we do have 2 meetings scheduled.
That doesn't affect this board.
It does not affect this board, but we do
Of
acknowledge
course,
that
it
LPA members were
makes sense that
present.
we will attend those meetings, but it does not affect the itinerary for this board.
That is correct. Yes, sir.
When will we be returning to City Hall?
Next month. Yes, so the public workshop and city council meeting will be at council chambers next month.
We expect this will be the last meeting held here. And we're
Acoustics in
very,
here are absolutely
Well, we're very grateful to the Bonita Springs Fire District Board, and thank you so much as a board member, Steve. Thank you so much for being so generous and allowing us to use this space for so long.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thanks for coming.
Good job there, Jerry.
Yeah.